This is The Hole, a 12-block neighborhood 10 miles from Manhattan, New York City, which is pretty much the opposite of what you see out here. In fact, the city would rather have you not know about this neighborhood, and that's exactly why we're here. So the reason this neighborhood is called The Hole is because the entire place sits 10 to 15 feet below the surrounding streets. It's pretty steep. It's also underdeveloped, lacks basic infrastructure, and the city says it's towed away over 100 abandoned vehicles and 100,000 pounds of trash, all of which were illegally dumped here. They're probably gonna need to come back for this car. On top of that, this is the New York City neighborhood with the fewest number of residents. And it's estimated that only about 50 people live here. Now, what's shocking about this forgotten little neighborhood is just how different it is from the rest of New York. In Manhattan, you've got some of the most expensive, iconic real estate in the entire world. But The Hole is exactly what it sounds like because it sits at the bottom of a basin between Brooklyn and Queens, which is actually too low for the city's sewer system, and that's why you see so much flooding around here. There is just this river of water being pumped out from one of the neighbors' basements, and what's crazy is it hasn't rained in days, yet even now this place is still kind of like a swamp. And that's why you see so much water, because there is no sewer here, and the properties that you do see here, they use septic tanks, but when it rains, those can overflow, which might be what some of this water is. And when it rains here, I'm sure things are just like an absolute lake. On top of that, this area is continually victimized by illegal dumping, where people who don't live here show up and just throw garbage, which is actually kind of sad. So right here, we've got an empty lot. It's full of garbage. That's like an abandoned camper or something. Beverage cups, random car parts, old tires. Honestly, it feels and is basically a wasteland. And my guess is you have all this vegetation here because there's always enough standing water for it to grow. And there is no way this old school camper is being used for anything. Look at this thing. Definitely an abandoned car. Looks like the dashboard is ripped up. But believe it or not, even though the city of New York has totally forgotten about and neglected this place, there are buildings here, some of which are private residences. And to the residents living here, surviving in New York takes on an entirely different meaning. And we're here to learn what it's like to live in the toughest neighborhood in New York City. I don't think I've ever seen this many abandoned campers in one place in my entire life. But scattered throughout all this debris, there are private residences. And the residents here are doing what many New Yorkers would not be able to do. You can see a little house right over here off to the side. This might have been a house at some point, but this one over here actually looks pretty nice. Now, the first thing worth mentioning is that if you are gonna live here, this is a 15-minute walk to the nearest train station, which is only one train, and it's kind of slow. Those buildings over there, that's actually the back of a shopping center, but there's no way to get directly into it. And although there's a busy street down this direction, if you look up north here, it's just trees, so there's no exit from this direction, which essentially means this neighborhood is cut off from everything. So it's not really an accessible neighborhood, and perhaps that's why people have been taking advantage of it. And because of how bad the flooding is here, even when it's not raining, you're probably gonna need a car if you wanna be in here and get in and out of this place easily. It's far to drive to places. You're gonna have to trek if you wanna find a grocery store. It's a lot of work. I hear roosters coming from this property, maybe. Perhaps they have like a chicken farm or something, chicken coop. Another thing to consider is that since there's no sewer and it floods a lot, wintertime snow removal probably doesn't happen, which means you're gonna want a vehicle with four-wheel drive. Wow, look at that. There's even an abandoned touring bus here. That is real crazy looking. Houston, Texas. Totally bizarre. This almost looks like some sort of military vehicle. Stewart and Stevenson. This might not be abandoned, and look at that. The trailer door has like an apartment door on it. Very strange. I'm not gonna knock. This, however, definitely looks abandoned. And it's not just snow removal that you'll probably not get any help with. You're not gonna get any help with anything if you live around here. And a lot of things that you might take for granted where you live, residents here have to do on their own. So if you want to be a resident here, self-sufficiency is going to be the key to your existence, because a lot of what you'd normally pay the city of New York to do for you, you got to do yourself. Exhibit A, look at these above ground power lines. Now those make a lot of sense here because with all of this flooding, I don't know how you'd bury them, but look at that tree. Look at how close it is to getting those lines. If it gets too big, normally that's something the city would come and remove. Trees that overhang the power lines, that have wires going into your house, that's a dangerous condition. Residents shouldn't have to deal with something like that on their own, and normally you'd call the parks department, they would take it out. But here, if you live in a house like that, you might need to get a chainsaw. At least, this is what one local resident had to do when overhanging branches created a dangerous condition near their house. Apparently, they called the parks department to come and fix some unsafe wires, as well as remove a tree that was just way too close. And like a normal person, they left a message with the parks department and waited for something to happen. And they kept waiting, and eventually nothing got done. The condition was still there, and it was getting worse. So the homeowner got out their chainsaw and took the tree down themselves. And that's just one example of something people here have to deal with that most of us never even think about. I see the Parks Department removing trees all over the city in more affluent neighborhoods, but the residents here don't deserve to be neglected just because they live in the only off-the-grid neighborhood New York has. Well, partially off the grid, but the sewers. The constant flooding and overflowing streets, that's the real issue here. And fighting the flooding is a constant battle for people who live here. So, for decades, residents here have been begging the city to install a proper sewer system so that this stops happening. But as you can see, that doesn't seem to be something the city has taken seriously or has any intention of doing anytime soon. And because there's no sewer system, again, all of these homes, they use a septic system. But since we're 10 to 15 feet below the surrounding streets, those overflow when it rains, which likely means that a lot of this flood water you see out here isn't exactly clean drinking water. And there's basically standing water here at all times in some form. And one of the first things residents here do to battle the flooding is they actually raise their properties. You can see there's like a foot or so difference between where this car's parked and where that little gate is for this house. Same deal over here with this car. It's parked on an elevated driveway. Look at how close the water line is here from this driveway to where this lake basically is still sitting. And although you can't actually walk down the street, there's kind of an elevated sidewalk here. Oh, this is crazy. Gotta just kind of move these yourself. Ugh. Can't say I've ever seen a sidewalk like this anywhere in New York. Usually the city would just clear all this up, but not over here. But because the elevation here is so low, pretty much every resident has a pump in their basement to get water from it back out into the streets, because even though this is very low, the basements in these properties are actually below what we see right now, and they are pretty much always flooding. And in order to keep their homes from getting destroyed whenever it rains, every building here is going to have one of those pumps, which are actually gas powered by a generator and can force water out from the lowest point, which is their basement, back out into the streets. But believe it or not, over 20 years ago, the city actually had a plan to raise the streets in this neighborhood and install proper sewers. But even though this obviously hasn't happened yet, the plans to improve this neighborhood with an actual sewer system are still included in the city's capital budget. And every few years, it comes up again for consideration, but nothing really seems to ever happen. The city last requested a proposal for sewers in 2019. However, since then, it's been radio silence. In fact, one resident who's lived here from the 70s is on record as saying that they'd like to see sewers in place within their lifetime. Will they get it? I mean, just look around. But the city's defenders say they've actually had good reason to delay these plans, even though they've been delaying them for over 2 decades. And unfortunately, the reason the city is giving for why they haven't taken any action, it's pretty much the same reason they have whenever they're supposed to do something and they don't. They say that they don't have the money and it's too expensive, even though a plan was already put into place and money was appropriated for this. So it might not look like it, but the city's already spent $3 million on the sewer project for this neighborhood. That's what I read somewhere. And now the city is saying that the money they received initially to begin this project was insufficient, which is probably true. I don't know how we would dispute that. I mean, just look around. There's not a whole lot here. Plus, whatever the cost of labor and materials were 20 years ago, I'm sure that's gone up since. And apparently the feasibility of rebuilding the roadways and raising the streets is somewhat in doubt. Basically, there's no way anything's gonna get done here without a lot more funding. But this has created kind of a roller coaster effect for the residents that live here. 20 years ago, they heard that, hey, there was funding for sewers that's been appropriated upgraded for your neighborhood. And then year after year, nothing happens. There's more bad news. It's got to be incredibly frustrating. And the folks that live here, they know that nothing is going to get done until they see a politician and a news crew with shovels breaking ground. And before we get into what the city's current plans are for this neighborhood, it's important to realize that the residents here, they have had it. And back in 2022, 40 of the town's residents sent letters to the Department of Transportation and the Department of Environmental Protection telling them to fix the sewers and get on with the project, along with other infrastructure improvements needed to keep this neighborhood from imploding. On top of that, they demanded a reassessment of what their property taxes are. And that's a big one because it's not really fair for the city to tax the residents here the same as they would other parts of town where they have snow removal, proper maintenance of power lines, working sewer systems, all the stuff you'd normally expect, neighborhoods that actually get paid attention to. If the city's not going to take care of this neighborhood, residents don't want to pay for them to do it. Think about it. It's completely unfair for folks here to be paying top dollar in taxes for what you see right here every single day. That's crazy. Furthermore, experts say that the problems this neighborhood is experiencing could start happening in other areas of New York. And if the rest of the city turns out to be just like this, New York is going to have a lot of problems. You see this right here? All this pavement, this is the reason why this neighborhood floods and other neighborhoods in New York City that have also been overbuilt are flooding as well. Remember, here we're in a basin, so if you put concrete here, the water's really got nowhere to go. And those are scenes from floods neighborhoods other than this experienced 2 months ago during what meteorologists said was just a normal large amount of rain for New York City. And the problem is the areas where those floods took place, they're also low-lying areas of the city, not necessarily as low as the Hole, but they're by a large polluted lake called the Gowanus Canal, and areas of that part of town looked like there had been a hurricane when in fact it was just normal weather patterns. And that had many observers asking why. I mean, after all, that part of town has sewers, and if you want to know why the Hole floods, here's a sewer, and yeah, that's pretty far below the sewer. And the problem here is that New York City is essentially overbuilt. That's why there's just too much concrete, too many buildings. Water essentially has nowhere to go. And normally in an area where there is a working sewer, water will run down the street until it finds an exit point, which in this case is right here. Got another one over here. But the problem is the sewers underneath the city streets, they're over 100 years old. And those were put in at a point when New York had around 3 million people, not the 8 million that it has today. And yes, the Hole has no sewer system, but there's not a lot of natural environment left here. Normally the standing water that you see here would be absorbed by green grass in the ground. But because this area is also pretty much nothing but concrete, when water does end up accumulating here, it's got nowhere to go. It just has to evaporate. In fact, one local resident reportedly had to redo not just their basement, but their entire first floor because a lot across from them was recently paved over and the water that used to drain there had nowhere else to go but into their particular property. Basically, as you can see here, everything that's of value is elevated in some manner to kind of keep it safe from the water. But the reason that this is such a test case for the rest of New York is because the mayor wants to build 500,000 new homes over the next 10 years. And that's got people wondering, where is all the water gonna go? And without those homes, New York City's not gonna keep pace with its own population growth. But if the Hole is extremely flood prone and now other areas of town are flood prone because they've been overbuilt, there might not be any way for the city to actually absorb 500,000 new residences. Here we have what looks like a recently constructed building in the actual Hole. You can see there's a little raised edge right there that leads onto the property. But then out front here, you can see that this probably turns into mud when it rains. But even though this neighborhood is certainly far from perfect and it does have its flooding problems, last year the residents of the Hole were able to put enough pressure on the city to get some basic improvements to the drainage. And once you know what those are, it'll make sense why there are new constructions here, or at least a single new construction. So even though the torrential floods that hit the city back in September were devastating to many areas, this area actually fared better than residents anticipated, and that's because of something the city did. Yes, things still flooded here, as they normally do, but after 2 days the streets were clean, which apparently doesn't usually happen. And that's because the city installed catch basins and local drainage pipes, and those have been helpful in distributing water that pools in some of the lowest parts of this neighborhood. And so far they seem to be working. Yes, having a flooded street after 2 days isn't necessarily a great thing for you or for your property, property, but it does give residents here some hope that the city's at least starting to pay attention to their needs. Speaking of which, the city's next date to discuss changes to this neighborhood isn't until 2029, which is kind of a long ways away. And as you can imagine, residents here have already heard everything on the books about what's gonna happen to their neighborhood, and nothing's happened yet. So you can't blame them for holding their breath, but hopefully something does happen. And hopefully the city does more for the folks who live here and are making it work, which is definitely not an easy task, especially when you're all on your own. But what do you think the city could do to help the folks that live here? Let me know. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.